The damp wind from the ocean presses against the shutters, and the house is permeated with the smell of wet wool, old lamp grease, and cold ashes. On the table lie not swords, but 3 items on which the fate of an adult couple depends: a set of keys to a chest, a list of dowry items, and a woolen belt that the witnesses will demand tomorrow. A chill sweeps across the yard. An icy rope catches somewhere, and it becomes clear. They are not preparing for battle here, but for a procedure. The North knew how to divorce with documents, without blood, and this knowledge chills more than any myth about the Vikings, who decided everything with steel. In the silence, you can hear the log crackling, and the house seems to know that tomorrow it will bear a new mark. Hello, viewers. I am glad to see you here. Write to me where you are watching this story from, and which aspects of Northern law seem the harshest or most honest to you. I wish you a peaceful and attentive viewing. Let's move on to the story. To understand why divorce in Iceland was not a flash of emotion, but a strict action, you need to imagine the structure of the island. There is no king here who dictates his will. There are tingi, assemblies of free people. There are godai, leaders who depend on trust rather than force. There is lögsogumadur, a person who recites a part of the law every year to keep it alive. In such a structure, honor is not a romantic category, but a social currency. And marriage is a form of contract where property and obligations are fixed no less than the boundaries of pastures. An adult woman's dowry, her husband's gifts, the property of the house, everything is described, calculated, and distributed. The union here is not only about the bed, but also about the economy. And when a marriage breaks up, the most dangerous thing is not the breakup of feelings, but the risk to the bloodline. That is why the formula for divorce looks like a surgical suture. 3 points, 3 consecutive actions, witnesses on both sides. At the threshold of the bedroom, at the door of the house, at the gate of the yard. No shouting, no noise, only established words, confirmed by witnesses. The myth says that Northerners settled everything with their fists. The document responds, fists are a failure of the system. The law was created to prevent passion from destroying the village. If an adult husband does not fulfill his duties, if his behavior is dangerous, if the house is starving because of his inaction, the divorce procedure is not only permitted, it is necessary to stop the threat. And its coldness is the most frightening thing. It requires precision, like a formula in a ritual, where every mistake gives reason to challenge the decision at the ting. The role of witnesses is particularly alarming. They are not defenders or friends. They are living anchors of order. They record everything: where they stood, who recited the formula, in which house, and at what time. Their task is to rule out the possibility of dispute. If the husband tries to keep the property or makes threats, it is their testimony that will give the tinge the right to impose a fine and compulsory division on him. Violence here turns into economic disaster for the offender. The sagas sometimes describe emotions, but they are always accompanied by lines from notebooks. The dowry has been returned. The keys have been handed over. The fabric has been measured. The silver has been accounted for. These records seem dry and cruel. They remind us that on the island, personal drama is always built into the economic cycle. If order is not maintained, there will be no haymaking, no market, and no winter grazing agreements next spring. When the divorce is complete, the consequences are visible not in words, but in things. The chest is carried away, the cows are counted, the share of the harvest is measured, and honesty is recorded not with a sword, but with these objects. This is how the island saved itself, not with heroism, but with cold respect for form. The myth of Vikings who lived with passion crumbles when you hear the rustle of parchment. The real power here lies in documents, and true honor lies in the ability to cross 3 thresholds without drawing a sword. the continuation grows directly from the point where adult witnesses stood at the gate, and the wind turned the hems of their woolen cloaks. The formula has been spoken, but this is only the beginning of a long journey that sagas rarely describe in detail, although it is in this silence that the true north is hidden. After the third threshold, the divorce is not considered complete. It has only become visible to the world, and now the community must intervene to tie humanity to the economy and emotions to order. Usually, the next step was a trip to the wife's neighbors, her relatives, or those who were considered her former home. There, witnesses repeated the fact, confirming that the formula had been followed. This was done not out of sentimentality, but out of necessity. The island is too small to argue about words. The proof had to live in 2 houses, otherwise any offense could turn into another lawsuit. And the stricter everything was formalized, the less chance there was that someone would try to force the marriage back together. But the most sinister aspect is not the procedure itself, but its consequences. Divorce is always a blow to the structure of the household. When an adult woman left the estate, she took her dowry with her, a chest, keys to separate stores, a share of livestock, and sometimes part of the winter feed. The husband lost not only a companion in the house, but also part of his means of survival. Therefore, the law demanded calm. Any violence turned an ordinary divorce into a serious violation, for which the ting could impose a huge fine or even declare the man unfit to manage a family. This punished honor more severely than the sword. The most disturbing detail is how many adult men and women sought to hide family rifts, fearing the shame that could spread to the entire clan. But Icelandic law was cold. Shame could not cancel out duty. If a spouse took up arms or made threats, witnesses recorded the violation. And then the divorce was finalized through an expedited procedure at the ting, where representatives of both parties had to present inventories of property. These inventories sometimes sound like a house search report. How much fabric, how much silver, what animals, what condition the barn is in, how winter supplies are distributed. Damage caused to the spouse by threats was recorded separately. Each line is a wound, but a documented wound. In the saga, this is often reflected briefly. The house was divided. But the reality behind these words was disturbing and difficult. People who were used to working together suddenly found themselves enemies in the legal sense. And in order to prevent blood feuds, the thing required mediators, adult men and women from related houses who knew how to count and speak calmly. They sat over chests, sorted through fabric, weighed silver, counted cows, and marked the boundaries of pastures. Their task was to turn an emotional rift into an administrative one. This is best seen in stories where the husband tried to resist. Documents show that the ting did not automatically protect him. Even a rich man could lose most of his property if he violated the divorce procedure. And the fear of this was so strong that many preferred to submit to the procedure, no matter how cold it seemed. As a result, the law broke the power of brute force, replacing it with the power of form. And this shift is what makes northern sources so frightening. They show that honor is not a feeling, but a duty. There is another layer, the political one. In the absence of a king, the ting was the only thing that kept the island from chaos. Any divorce that was not conducted properly became a threat to the entire community. Two clans could enter into a cycle of lawsuits that lasted for years. The sagas contain many such stories, where poorly executed divorces led to new conflicts. Therefore, society treated the procedure as sacred. No one had the right to violate the sequence of the 3 points of divorce, otherwise the consequences would fall on the entire clan. The most frightening thing was how the procedure made people vulnerable. Adult men had to admit that their wives were leaving home, which was not only a personal blow, but also a threat to their political position. Adult women had to return to their parents' home with property that was sometimes insufficient. And yet, the law chose the lesser evil, a document instead of blood. When the witnesses finally submitted their confirmation to the ting, the case turned into a chain of actions: the appointment of mediators, distribution, recording, and no emotions could interfere anymore. The sheets of paper recorded fate, and the people around understood that whatever happened, it was safer for everyone. It is in this cold rationalism that the North reveals its heart, not in fights, but in its ability to separate people with words and witnesses. And yet, beneath this calm, there is a sense of tension. Any mistake is an explosion. Any wrong step is a spark that can stretch out over a lifetime. That is why sagas so often mention documents in passing, almost indifferently. Their presence is so fundamental that the characters do not even comment on them. But every word in these notebooks is a scar of time. And yet, this paper protection did not make the world any gentler. On the contrary, the stricter the procedure became, the clearer it became how much pain was hidden in it. Divorce broke not only the couple, but also the network of exchanges between families. Unions were formed with the expectation of decades of joint haymaking, shared wintering of livestock, and mutual loans of silver and goods. When adult spouses separated, it was not enough to simply divide the chest and the cows. The entire fabric of agreements had to be rewritten. That is why the law required the presence of witnesses from both clans. Everyone had to see that the breakup was done cleanly, without hidden theft or substitution of reasons. Sagas sometimes provide rare but accurate details. Adult men sitting on benches opposite each other do not grab axes, but silently listen to the listing of property. Adult women, sorting through fabric, check the quality of each piece, because it is not comfort that depends on it, but survival through the winter. What a modern reader would call an emotional breakdown is transformed into a calculation. This is more frightening than any violent episode. In the silence, it is clear that fate is measured not by cries, but by the measure of grain and the length of a belt. Against this backdrop, articles about the reasons for which divorce is permitted sound particularly harsh. Cruelty and danger to life, a husband's refusal to provide for the household, heavy drinking, shameful acts that damage the family's honor, prolonged absence without caring for the household. All of this is listed in the law not as moral judgments, but as legal grounds. For an adult, such wording means that personal pain has been given the status of fact. The law turns humiliation into a basis for action, and this deprives the offender of a convenient shield. One cannot hide behind family and power if the ting recognizes what it has heard as sufficient grounds for divorce. The picture becomes even bleaker after the adoption of Christianity, when a new layer of church requirements is added to the old customs. Marriage takes on a religious character, but the island does not abandon its procedures. In some cases, a double contour has to be drawn. Before the community, a formula with 3 dots; before the church authorities, recognition of the fact of the breakup, sometimes with mention of guilt. This increased the pressure on adult spouses, but did not change the main thing. Economic and social calculations remained in the hands of the ting. The result was a strange hybrid. The union was declared sacred, but the breakup was still treated as an inventory operation where the first thing to be counted was the sheep. The myth that northern honor demands blood for any offense is shattered here. In reality, honor requires that people continue to work together. If every divorce ended in murder, in a couple of generations, there would be no one left to remove the turf. Therefore, the law replaces reactive rage with a prescribed procedure. It is easier for an adult man to endure the shame of a formal divorce than the shame of expulsion for violating the order. It is easier for an adult woman to cross 3 thresholds than to cause an inter-clan war that will result in starvation for everyone. The most disturbing episodes occur when the procedure is violated. Sagas and legal compilations preserve memories of cases when a husband or his relatives try to thwart a divorce with threats or force. Then the entire mechanism of coercion is activated. Witnesses testify, mediators record the attempt to exert pressure, and the ting imposes a fine or declares the violator an outlaw. This situation does not mean romantic exile, but practical death. A person is deprived of the right to protection, to participate in bargaining, to legal support from relatives. His house can be looted without consequences for the attackers. Adults understand this prospect too well to recklessly go against the formula. Cold law is more frightening than hot anger. In this system, divorce unexpectedly becomes a tool for preserving honor, not destroying it. Honor is understood not as the ability to take revenge, but as the ability to break a destructive union in such a way that no one can say that there is lying, stealing, or hiding of what belongs to others. An adult woman who has taken advantage of the procedure is not running away in the eyes of the law, but restoring balance. An adult man who recognizes her right and fulfills the conditions of the division saves face where, in another context, he would be considered broken. Icelandic texts are frightening because they show that where you expect a bloodbath, there is a list of property. Where you expect loud curses, there is a calm formula. Where the modern viewer imagines a cinematic duel on the rocks, there is a thing site with rows of people sitting and listening for hours to the enumeration of cows, chests, and plots of meadows. This monotony does not negate the pain, but turns it into a manageable factor. As a result, the myth of Vikings who decide everything with a sword turns out to be a convenient smokescreen over a world where survival depends on how accurately adults can pronounce the right words at the three thresholds, gather witnesses, and endure the procedure. Where the myth requires a fist, the document requires memory, and it is precisely this memory of the formula, the terms, the descriptions that keeps the island afloat longer than any vicious blow with steel. Further on, it becomes apparent how divorce is woven into the general fabric of conflicts, which the sagas describe with a clear longing for order. The same families appear in stories of bloody clashes and stories of subtle legal maneuvers. In one episode, a grown man raises his hand, and the chain of revenge stretches across several winters. In another, the same clan prefers to send people to the ting with a chest of documents rather than weapons. In texts known as grey geese, divorce norms stand alongside norms on blood feuds and fines for murder. This proximity shows how the community tries to maintain peace by regulating people before they turn disagreement into a corpse. The mediation mechanism that works around marriage is similar to the same system that is applied to any serious disputes. Adult representatives of clans gather at the ting, bring their people, and the law speaker recites the necessary articles so that no one can claim ignorance. Sometimes old grudges, debts, and inheritance issues are added to the divorce case. Then, the mediators literally untangle the knot: a separate fine for threats, a separate division of the house, a separate settlement of the previous lawsuit. For the parties, this is a hellish burden, but for the island, it is a way to relieve tension without more bloodshed in the meadow. If we view these scenes as a cold mechanism, it becomes clear how the fragile balance of the island's economy is maintained at the expense of the nerves of individual adults. Pain and cruelty in this world are not only manifested in obvious fights. Cruelty is also forced decisions when an adult woman is returned to her family home with much less property than was promised, because part of it was eaten by a poor harvest or an unsuccessful flight. Cruelty is when the ting may recognize the divorce formula as legal, but leaves one side in an almost destitute position, simply because there is nothing left to divide. Then, the protocols state, the dowry is partially lost for reasons not related to the husband's fault, and division is possible only within the limits of what is available. The law is incapable of sympathy. It can only record facts. Political pressure also does not disappear. An adult man from an influential family risks losing face if distant tings find out about the divorce. So sometimes relatives try to resolve everything internally, pressuring the woman not to pronounce the formula. But the norms of gray geese and the practice of ting create loopholes for her. The opportunity to announce the breakup in front of witnesses outside her own courtyard. The opportunity to find support from another Gaudi if her own refuses to defend her. Each such loophole is a hidden blow to the power of brute force. The North did not call this rights in the modern sense, but in fact built mechanisms that gave an adult a way out of a dead end without turning the home into a battlefield. At this point, myth and document clash. The image of a cinematic warrior who resolves everything in a single day is shattered by the reality of lengthy procedures. Sometimes the divorce dragged on for several seasons. The formulas were spoken. The witnesses remembered everything. But the ting was convened in the summer, and until then, it was necessary to survive, maintaining at least some order in the home. People who were no longer spouses de jure, but still shared fire and food, de facto found themselves under the same roof. To the modern mind, this seems like torture. For the island, it was a necessary bridge between the letter of the law and the practice of survival. During these months and years, a network of mediators worked especially hard. Neighbors, relatives, church people, wealthy farmers, whose words carried more weight at the ting. Where mediation failed, tougher mechanisms came into play. Outlawing, deprivation of support, closure of access to common pastures. All these were forms of political and economic violence sanctioned by the community against those who disrupted the procedure. An adult who was outlawed for disrupting a divorce through threats or violence effectively lost his name. His property could be divided as if he were dead, and he himself became a target. This is an extreme form of pressure, but it shows how seriously the island took formal steps in family matters. Divorces in the sagas often appear as brief interludes between major conflicts. However, when viewed through the eyes of an archivist, it is precisely in them that the nerve of the era can be seen. Here, the fear of hunger, the fear of shame, the fear of God's condemnation after baptism, and the fear of outlaw status collide. Law and custom attempt to distribute these fears so that none of them destroys the community. Marriage becomes a knot that can be untied, but only by the same universally understood movements. And adults who in other situations might take up arms are here forced to sit on a bench, listen to a list of property, and wait for the ting's decision. Where the modern viewer seeks romantic freedom, the documentary shows the heavy price of choice. An adult woman, leaving according to the formula, knew that she would save her life and part of her property, but would lose part of her support. An adult man, accepting divorce, understood that he would cease to be the master of the entire house and could lose the respect of some of his relatives. Nevertheless, both chose this path when the alternative was an endless chain of blood feuds. This cold calculation echoes the main theme of Northern law. Honor does not eliminate fear, but learns to live with it, subjecting it to procedure. This is how a grim pattern emerges. The North, which is popular in the imagination thanks to the sword, is based on a formula in the sources. Where myth expects an adult to strike, the document forces him to think. And every time the words of divorce were heard at the three thresholds, the island relied not on heroism, but on the fact that next spring there would still be someone to take the cattle out to pasture. And yet, each such case left a mark, not only on the fate of adults, but also on the structure of the entire community. Any divorce, triggered chain reactions that cannot be seen without careful reading of the Ting. The breakdown of a marriage meant that new boundaries were created. One house lost some of its people, another gained extra responsibilities, and a third had to participate in mediation or provide pasture as collateral. The sagas rarely mention this in words, but the documents show that divorce always involves a redistribution of power. Adults leave each other, but their clans inevitably continue to interact through markets, roads, and mutual agreements. After the formal recognition of the breakup, the Ting moved on to the main, most painful part, determining who gets what. Here, the harsh edge of northern realism comes to the fore. The island could not afford the luxury of dividing everything in half. Property was divided according to real need. Those who remained in the house received most of the food supplies, because otherwise they would have died in the first winter. Those who left took their dowry, some of their clothes, a share of the silver, and possibly a couple of cows or sheep, if there were enough to allow both sides to survive. Sometimes the decisions were unfair, but fairness gave way to survival. The documents record such cases without emotion, which makes them even more frightening. The deeper one looks into the archives, the clearer another truth becomes. Divorces were often not so much the result of personal conflicts as a way to prevent economic collapse. If a grown man became a danger to the household because of drunkenness or recklessness, or if a grown woman was threatened with poverty because of her husband's inability to manage the household, divorce became a tool for protecting the entire estate. The law did not say this explicitly, but indirect records, the condition of barns, the quality of winter supplies, the number of livestock, reveal the true mechanism. Divorce cut off the rotten branch to save the tree. Where the decision was difficult, mediators held lengthy negotiations. They sat by the fire, checked documents, and consulted with neighbors to minimize damage. Their task was not to reconcile feelings, but to restore balance. They understood that if the division was carried out unfairly, a dispute would flare up at the next Ting, which could escalate into a bloody conflict. Therefore, in these negotiations, adults had to swallow their pride and listen to what was difficult to hear. This is where the particular cruelty of the northern world manifests itself. It requires not courage, but discipline from a person. The moment when the Ting declares the decision final becomes even more alarming. From that second on, the divorce becomes a social fact. The parchment records, the signatures of the witnesses, the presence of the Godi, all this cements the outcome. The adult spouses return to their homes, each devastated in their own way. But the law is not interested in their feelings. It looks at winter, at livestock, at fields. And what would evoke sympathy in us becomes a necessity here. However, the most depressing thing is the silence after the decision. The house where the two lived now sounds different. One rhythm of footsteps, one breath, one pair of hands disappears. Sagas rarely pay attention to this, but the Ting leaves traces that speak louder. Sometimes after a divorce, a grown man would go to relatives in the south of the island for seasonal work so as not to be a burden. Sometimes a grown woman would live with relatives until the following summer, until the Ting finally distributed the land. Their lives fell apart into practical tasks, and in this, we hear the true cruelty of a world that does not tolerate emptiness. Added to this was the political cost. Divorce could weaken the clan's position, disrupt agreements with neighbors, and bury plans for profitable alliances. Relatives watched such cases with concern. Every decision of the Ting affected the web of relationships that had been built up over years. Therefore, divorce often became a political tool. Feuding families could use it as a pretext for pressure, and influential goddess as a way to demonstrate power or diplomacy. And yet, no clan allowed itself to violate the procedure. The price was too high. This grim picture, reveals why the sagas value the document. A sword is beautiful in stories, but useless in reality, where winter is longer than pride. Only precise procedure, only the testimony of witnesses, only cold consistency of action kept the island from chaos. Divorce in Iceland was not an escape. It was a tool for survival. And that is why the sagas do not romanticize these episodes. They are brief but heavy. In their pauses, you can hear the breath of people who understand. The law may be harsh, but without it, the house will collapse.